is Ed Ashford, and I am honored to have been asked to be the moderator for this plenary. I'd like, therefore, to welcome you to the plenary on the impact of satellite communications in a global market. In my lifetime, I've seen two great technological achievements. The first has been the ability of mankind to escape the gravitational pull of the Earth and launch satellites or probes into outer space. The second has been the digital communication resurgence that has allowed people over the world to be able to be in communication with anyone else at instantaneous speeds, according to at least light speeds, and at a relatively low cost. And at the juncture of these two technological achievements are communication satellites that help to do both. And therefore, this plenary is devoted to how communication satellites will in the future be able to interconnect people, particularly people today that have not the ability to interconnect because of lack of communication or lack of interconnectivity in their countries or in their regions and countries that are not served by terrestrial communications. To this end, we've brought together a panel of experts representing both operators and satellite manufacturers. The operators are a selected group who either provide services in the African continent in particular or who plan to do so. And the operators are two operators that represent European and North American, the satellite manufacturers, I should say, represent European and North American manufacturers for satellites that will be able to provide in orbit the capabilities to provide services for communications. To introduce very briefly the people, starting from my left is Didier Lebulch, who is the Director of R&D and Product Policy for Thales Alenia. Next to him is Lade Okunyai, sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, who is the African Marketing Director for O3B Networks. Next to him is Jonathan Osler, Managing Director for Eutelsat African Sales. Next to him is Bob Prevost, Vice President for Marketing and Sales of Space Systems L'Oréal. And next to him is Joaquim Pereira da Lima, Managing Director of Eutelsat Madeira. And finally, last but not least, Kevin Viray, Regional Director for Africa for Eutelsat. The process of this plenary will be that I will ask each of the panelists to give a very brief introduction to you of their companies or themselves and of what they do and what they will be able to do to help in the future provide developing nations more connectivity. After that, I may ask a few questions myself based on what the panelists have said. And then the major part will be to open it up to questions from the floor. And please don't be shy. These panelists are here to answer your questions, so we'll be happy to have more questions than they can answer rather than less questions. That being said, I'd like to start by asking Didier to come up forward and make the first presentation. And
thank you, Ed.
I then have to minimize that and maximize that. And you should be on.
Perfect. Do we switch to presentation mode? Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. So it's a big pleasure to present that for you, even if it's a challenge to address such a wide topic in a couple of minutes. So I will very briefly tell what Thales Alenia Space is and is doing for the global communication infrastructure. I decided to focus mainly on three services because SATCOM may do a lot of things, but in a couple of minutes I decided to focus on mobile communications, on trunking or backhauling services, and on wideband. It's already a challenge. So what do we do in Thales Alenia Space? Basically, we design, build, and integrate, deliver space systems for our customers. And in four fields, mainly telecommunication, but also observation, navigation, and exploration. And our positioning in the value chain ranges from equipments that we sell to ourselves, but also to our customers and to our competitors, and up to global end-to-end systems. On the mobile, the big thing that is happening now is the renewal of the constellations. Everybody in space remembers the difficulties of constellation at the very beginning, but now it's restarting with a safer business plan, and we are very proud to produce currently the Global Star constellation. We have launched the second batch of satellites this summer, and we also design very actively the next generation of Iridium, called simply Iridium Next. And the key assets for this constellation in mobile is their global coverage. You can never reach such a global coverage with a geostationary satellite, whereas with a constellation in low Earth or medium Earth orbit, you can address any point of the Earth. The next big move in terms of services is about the trunking. For this kind of backhauling services, geostationary satellites are used since decades. And the only drawback of these satellites is the distance that you cannot fight. And even at the speed of light, it introduces a small delay from the Earth to the geostationary orbit. So the new approach proposed by O3B, and you will have much more detail later with a colleague that will insist on this aspect, is this particular design constellation that is closer to the Earth and that is enabling shorter delay, later latency for GSM backhauling. And this morning in the plenary session, they were mentioning that this will explode in Africa to interconnect mobile communication hubs, thanks to satellites and with minimum latency. Last but not least slide, what is happening on the broadband area? On the broadband, we are all seeking for coverage on one side to cover the rural areas or the areas where the terrestrial communications do not reach the customer. And we all seek also for the lowest cost for bandwidth. And I have a very simple recipe to propose to you, which explains what drives the cost per bandwidth. And in fact, what drives the cost of the bandwidth to have the cheapest possible services is not the satellite design. Of course, it is linked to the satellite design, but the very original point that drives the economics of that is the user density. Because if you have a very high user density, you will be able to build a satellite with narrow spots, very narrow spots, and thanks to the gain you can extract from this kind of antennas, you will amplify the very, very large bandwidth up to the full K-band bandwidth, which is 2.9 gigahertz, with one single onboard amplifier. Which means that with one single piece of hardware, you will be able to generate very, very high throughput, this throughput being focused on a very narrow spot of, for instance, 0.2 degree. So this is the trend of satellites like terabit satellites that will try to fight against optical fiber. Whereas on the other hand of this little simplified diagram, you find systems targeting the complete coverage of the Earth. And when you address, for instance, if you are in Marsat, you want to address global customer over the complete Earth, you have no choice than to make spot beams a bit bigger. And in these bigger spot beams, you will be condemned, if I may, to have the same rules and the same approach as in Ku band, which is to amplify more or less 30 megs with one amplifier. And what drives your economics is the number of megabits you can put in one transponder. So what is funny to see in this diagram is when you move from one global coverage to a very, very extremely focused coverage to try to reach the highest data rate, your capacity is increasing from a ratio 1:1 compared to Ka-band equals to Ku-band if you do spots of 2 degree. And it's 10 times more powerful than Ku-band if you have spots of 0.2 degree. But the user density itself is amplified by a factor of 10,000 if you move from the right side to the left side. So clearly, it depends on user density, the level of performance you will reach. And vice versa, it's clear also that if you have very good economics, you will attract more customers to satellites than if you are not. So in each range of this table, you find a comparison of satellites with 2GPP or satellites with ADSL, which is currently what we do, with the example here of IAC, which will be deployed very soon and will be detailed by a colleague at the end of this session. And the future is even narrower spots with even more capacity. Thank you for your attention.
Rather than me trying to get up there and introduce everybody one at a time, just come up and turn if you would.
Hi, my name is Ladio Kune, as I was introduced earlier. I'm the marketing director over at O3B Networks. I first want to apologize. Murphy's Law kicked in, and my presentation that I had for you was not able to work, so I'll just give you a verbal overview of O3B. I think he touched a little bit on what we're doing, and we're essentially building what we consider to be a next generation satellite constellation. It's going to be an initial constellation of 8 medium Earth orbit satellites that will be revolving around the Earth about 4 times per day. That will offer continuous coverage. When one satellite leaves, another satellite takes over without transmission interruption. We're going to have over 70 Ka-band beams, each of over 700 kilometers in diameter, steerable around the globe, each delivering up to 1.2 gigabits of capacity. The project is 100% funded, and we're looking to launch early 2013. O3B was actually designed to solve a unique problem. And those problems vary from region to region. You can see in certain places in Africa where 3G is already a mainstay in some of the more developed markets, and some of these markets are going to be moving on to technologies such as LTE. You have companies like Eutelsat who are already testing that in the UAE, but certainly plan to implement that across some parts of their networks across Africa as well. The reason we see this as important is because the mobile operators are going to be the ISPs of the future in Africa. It's just not practical to lay terrestrial cables in most of our environments. So what that means for us is there will always be a role for satellite technology to play. And for that reason, we have designed a system that we want to have the characteristics of fiber optic technology in terms of the capacity it's able to deliver, and also in terms of latency, to ensure that even applications that are susceptible to things like delays are not going to be affected once we actually launch our services. So we are designing our satellite constellation to serve the significant global base of underserved markets. You still have teledensity, and even in large markets like Nigeria, it's still under 20%, and that's one of the more well-covered markets in the continent. Our system is primarily designed for IP trunking, which is delivering a whole lot of internet bandwidth to one central aggregation location. And our vision for this solution is to be able to offer into emerging markets world-class value-added IP services, and with a strong focus on content pairing and advanced connectivity solutions. A lot of these markets are also currently being served by inclined orbit capacity, which is, and we believe that our solution is a superior and a longer term and a longer availability solution. And our vision is to position ourselves as a carrier's carrier, while also offering outstanding customer services. We see O3B as playing a significant role in the voice and data strategy of mobile operators, as I alluded to earlier, as they evolve more of their networks towards 3G, and the data requirements on their networks continue to grow. We see us as being well positioned to be able to help them address those needs and to help them bring connectivity into emerging markets, because like I mentioned earlier, they're the ones who are going to have to connect most of the unconnected people within the continent. We believe that we can shift the mindset from having satellite as a mobile backhaul option, as a permanent option, not just as a as a choice of last resort, but actually as an integral part of their network capacity planning. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm John Oesler with Eutelsat. I'm the managing director for the Africa sales team located in Johannesburg, South Africa. Our organization is a global satellite company. We currently lead the pack as far as the number of assets we have around the world, from revenues, resources, satellites, and services. We provide critical commercial infrastructure globally. And when we look at our business, there really are three core sectors that we have to provide services for. The first is media. And satellite traditionally is a one-to-many large geographic area service, and we see that continuing. So that is media distribution, television. Today we're hosting over 30 direct-to-home platforms around the world, delivering 270 HD channels in the special events that we've all come to love. One of our fastest growing services is the government service. It's having the right capacity for the right application, covering the right areas around the world. So our governments, whether it be the US or coalition governments, are looking for reliable, secure global bandwidth, enough capacity to be able to get the message delivered in the markets in which they're operating. So in-theater communications, solutions for the warfighter is critical for our industry to continue to work, and we feel that we're leading in that market. And then it's network services. And network services is a vast array of services being delivered to every continent on the globe. So it's critical infrastructure. It's telecom backbones. It's wireless network expansions. It's private networks. And until you come and you operate in a rural, sort of third world continent, you don't realize how this technology serves to actually continue to bridge the digital divide. So services that many of us, how many people come from Europe? And how many people come from the US? And how many people are off the African continent? And the rest of you don't count. So, no. But things that you absolutely begin to rely on a daily basis, which is availability of very fast, very quick connectivity to the internet, the ability to be anywhere and to have your GSM phone ringing in your pocket as you give a speech. But the ability to have basic and core services is exactly what this industry will continue to support. And I had several people have talked about fiber and trying to actually continue to be viable as fiber comes to the continent, and I'm speaking specifically about Africa. We don't necessarily see that as a threat. We see that we have very much complementary technologies in areas that on this particular continent that will not be served by fiber or terrestrial services will use satellite for many years to come. And that's a statement that goes across and around the world. There are areas that satellite will be able to serve better, and network services is one of those core areas because we have the ability to offer with satellite ubiquitous broadband in emerging markets. And it's extremely reliable, and it is extremely cost efficient. So let's talk a little bit about Eutelsat in Africa. We've been operating in Africa for over 40 years. We have 21 satellites that currently cover the region. And in that's 419 units of capacity, which is about just over 45% more than any of the other service providers today in the amount of capacity that we have. We have a very long heritage and a very proud heritage in Africa. We've had many firsts that we're proud of. We were the first to introduce satellite services with Telkom, which is our first customer. We were the first to launch pan-regional broadband networks in 2003. We put the first DTH services up over the area. We supply satellite connectivity to over 50 mobile operators, including all of the major blue chip service providers. And we were the first to conduct education training for hundreds of engineers, which is very important in this market because social responsibility is key to the development of the African continent. Today we service just over 200 customers, and in this continent alone, we're delivering 350 channels, about 300 radio stations to users. On the media side, MultiChoice, for those of you from the continent, is certainly one of our premier partners. And on the network services side, we're really proud of our customer base of companies like Airtel, Orange, Vodacom, NTN, the World Bank, Gateway, and of course many of militaries and IGOs, including the UN. As I said before, we have a continent that covers the entire world. We're operating over 50 satellites. And with those 50 satellites, we operate 7 teleports for our customers to be able to download content on and off the continent. And then we operate 28,000 miles of fiber optics, which actually goes to connect all of our teleports and gives our customers the ability to move their data from one region of the world to another. So what we're delivering is very flexible, resilient infrastructure that is there to support current needs as well as future requirements. We're in the middle of our largest fleet deployment and revitalization program. We currently have 7 satellites in the factory. For this continent, in March, we were very proud to launch our first Africa for Africa satellite, which was a joint venture between Eutelsat and a local South African company by the name of Convergence Partners, which was newed on. And we have 3 more satellites that will actually come to support services on this continent, IS-23, 22, and 20. And those satellites come with newest technology as far as being able to deliver multi-frequency reuse, and the services are required to actually grow this continent and meet the current needs as well as the needs into the future. So we talked a little bit about teleports, robust ground infrastructure that supports the growth on this continent and has the ability to move data into sort of first world teleports. So we're operating, this looks like 8, it is 8, but we actually are closing down 1 in Clarksburg, and we'll integrate that into our mountainside teleport. So 7 teleports that allow us to provide connectivity to any one of our 50 satellites, fully interconnected with 28,000 miles of fiber. This is sort of a look at the Intelsat 1 network infrastructure. As you'll see, it covers all continents around the world and has the ability to backhaul data to meet the customer's needs and requirements. So, Africa is a particularly challenging environment, and when you look at it, and for those of you who got to fly across it, you don't realize how big it is when you look at the maps. 10 hours from Europe, 6 hours if you came, or actually, yes, 8 hours from Dakar, and if you came from the U.S., you probably are still wanting to walk around and not sit. But Africa has, it's 11,608,000 square miles in it. And if you look at the diversity, I'm about to be done. If you look at the diversity, satellite is truly what it brings, the ability for the entire continent to connect. Regional review, roughly $450 million in annual revenues. Our growth opportunities are very strong in DTH and wireless extension. Our strategy is to lead in wireless service inventions to be able to deliver more bits. And I think our message to the market is really this, and that is we're going to put the right capacity over the market that meets the requirements of applications being on the right capacity with the right technology. Just some interesting economic trends. If you look at Africa, Middle East, I think the challenge for us as an industry is to be able to support these macro trends. If you look at subscriber phone, the smartphone and smartphone penetration, you'll see that there's huge growth, pay TV, business broadband, and then the other types of terrestrial connectivity that's coming to the market. So I've overtaken my time, but thank you. Sorry, I'll fight for this. That's okay.
Thank you there. Let's see. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Prevost from Space Systems Loral. Excuse me. I think we're sorted out now. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak to some items here that are from the manufacturing side as opposed to the operator side. For those of you that don't notice, we're a relatively modest company. We're in California, in the U.S., and our primary operation is manufacturing communication satellites. We've been in business for 50 years, since the beginning of satellite communications. We're one of the leading providers. A number of our customers, among them the leading operators in the world. We have a very large fleet of 66 satellites in orbit, 22 satellites in backlog. And over our long history, we're very proud of what we've been able to contribute to communications throughout the entire world. When we go back and look at how things have evolved, how the world has changed, and the important piece that communications have played, and certainly satellite communications. In terms of satellites and how they affect the developing and industrialized country, first of all, there's ubiquity. So again, you have coverages to low density in rural areas. If you want to go into service, it's relatively straightforward. Once the satellite's up there, there's not a need to build in ground infrastructure. So there's a certain amount of flexibility in that, from that aspect. Satellites can be used either direct to the users, or more frequently, probably in the evolving data environment, we'll be looking at them as an integrated node in an overall data system. Broadcast services are a little bit different in that once you build out your infrastructure, it's very easy to try to generate more revenue in the sense that there's not an incremental cost. So if you have data systems for each user, you need a different set of plant, you need a different asset of the satellite network. In the broadcast business, each subscriber that you add to your business gives you a better revenue. And we've seen that in the industrializing countries in terms, we compare what it costs for broadcast services in Europe or in the United States, and you look at that other countries, that it's a fraction of what that service costs, because that's what those, not only what those economies can support, but it's also the nature of the broadcast system itself. The next thing that we have is that is coming along is what we call high throughput satellites, and these are the spot beam broadband type satellites. The intention of these satellites is try to specifically reduce the cost per bit of data information that's traveling through the system. So in the satellite business over the last 20 years, we've seen a huge evolution in the capacity and capabilities of the satellite, and also a relative decrease in the cost of what it costs to operate and the amount of information or traffic we can put through the satellite systems. We've had increases in the DC to RF power consumption, but more importantly, in the power generation and storage efficiency has doubled in the last 20 years. So if you look at the two graphs, the one on the left shows the spread of how the satellite power generation capability has moved from 2 kilowatts up to the range of 20 kilowatts. So we've really gone up in order of magnitude in the power generation, which then translates to your ability to provide services to the ground. Same time, the satellites have gotten much heavier. So we're up against now building huge satellites in that are up to the point of being difficult to launch economically. So when we look at this trend, this historical view of satellites, it's very unlikely that we're going to see this kind of change in the future, to see an order of magnitude in the technology that allows us to build up the system and decrease the cost of the services, one to compete profitably with the terrestrial or alternate services. But then the other one is, excuse me, anyway, we think that we're up against the stops here on what we can do with the technology. But so the next thing that we have to do is our hopes is that we have to get smarter and more efficient. So we want to try to reduce the cost per transponder or the cost for bits. Two approaches to this. One is larger satellites so they can be more capable for fixed launch costs. So we'll need improved technology for the launchers. One thing that's very promising is electric propulsion, which allows us to get the satellites to orbit with a lot more payload on them. We take about half of the mass of the satellite, if not more, is just in fuel. And so anything we can do to reduce that and make the satellite more efficient translates into the ability to have higher capacity in the satellite. The next one is to have more efficient satellites, and we're looking at ways to decrease the cost per bit, flexible allocation of some of the performance items in the satellites, and then we'll talk about the high throughput satellite. So in this graph here, if you look at the chart, there's three frequency bands that are primarily used for data communication and carry a majority of the traffic through satellites. C-band is a relatively small bandwidth associated with it. If you were to build a system that only used that band, you would have a little bit less than 10 gigahertz of available bandwidth in a system, and you could satisfy with that with 1 or 2 satellites. In the KA, if you were able to do it, you have several gigahertz notionally available depending on the application. By the time you multiply that with spatial reuse for regional beams or spot beams, we're looking on the order of 10 to 20 gigahertz. But in order to provide those services, as typical for type of terminals and applications that we see, you really need a large number of satellites. Again, to be able to use that, you need 3 to 10 satellites, and they have a relatively modest amount of throughput. So what we're seeing now is what's called the high throughput satellites, and we're going to increase the spatial reuse by an order of magnitude. So by going to very small spot beams, we need less satellite resources in each spot, but we can carry an equivalent amount of data. So when you look at the numbers in the column of the spatial reuse, we're going from a relatively small number of a multiplier up to a much larger number of multiplier depending on the number of spot beams we have on the satellite. So we're actually looking at bandwidths on the order of hundreds of gigahertz of availability for data on 1 to 2 satellites. The other point that's important to realize is that the satellites that we're talking about incrementally in terms of cost, if I compare them to a very large KU satellite, some of these broadband satellites are going to be in the order of 20 to 30% higher in cost. So we're getting orders of magnitude increased throughput for relatively modest increase in cost. So that, again, we're looking at the high throughput satellites. We don't believe that satellites are going to go away. There's an awful lot of bandwidth that can be transferred with these high throughput satellites, but the world has never really wanted less bandwidth. There's been times when we've had maybe gluts in transponders, but sooner or later the applications arrive and fill that need. Thank you.
Somewhere here. Yep. Up. Oh, there we go. Yeah, sorry. And then we should be able to maximize it somehow. Yep.
Right, good afternoon. As this is not a business gathering on satellite communications, I won't address any commercial or marketing issues. I will just give some background information about Eutelsat, and I will refer some corporate data and highlight some aspects of our activity. In the few slides that I prepared, I tried to illustrate some aspects picked up from the paper that the organizers have addressed to the panelists as a sort of guide for the panel. And I found two of them particularly interesting. There was a question, will established but restructured operators be fully responsible to fulfill the appropriate role in the telecommunication needs of the overall global economy? Well, Eutelsat is one of those restructured operators. Maybe you don't know, but we were one of those intergovernmental organizations launched in the 60s to provide and to develop satellite communications. Well, since Eutelsat restructured in the mid-2001, we became an international group with offices in several European countries, North and South America, and the Far East. We became a listed company and our stock market value multiplied by 3. And last but not the least, we launched 18 satellites. The other question is that I selected is how will advances in satellite systems complement terrestrial systems for global and affordable services? It's more or less like this, not textual. Is it a matter of technology, financial assistance, institutional arrangements? What I can say, my view is that satellites, this is not only my view, it's a fact, satellites have worked in tandem with terrestrial systems for many years to the benefit of the business community and of the populations. Recently, though, we have witnessed the arrival of a new concept, the one of the high-throughput satellites that operate in Ka-band and can achieve capacities that are a few orders of magnitude above those of traditional systems. Eutelsat is one of the pioneers in this domain with its KSAT system. While I leave the aspects for financial assistance and institutional arrangements, which are probably a little bit beyond the scope of this panel, but if someone wants to raise questions, maybe there are some interesting ideas coming out. Now, just Eutelsat is an international group, as I mentioned, it's based in Paris. We have been operating satellite communications for more than 30 years. We run today a fleet of 28 satellites, and we have a program of 6 additional satellites to be launched. 700 staff members from 30 countries, which makes of us a fully international environment, listed in the Euronext in Paris. We listed revenues in June 2011 of 1.1 billion euros, and we have a backlog of nearly 5 billion euros, which is equivalent to approximate 4.2 years of revenue. This fleet, the satellite is, well, just let's not go to in detail. The picture is very small, but we can see that we operate satellite capacity on an orbital arch stretching from 15 degrees west all the way to 70.5 east. This is subsidiaries. Group, video service is the most important slice of revenue, but data and broadband services are also important. We operate 3 teleports to provide video and broadband data services to the end customers, and as a reflect of our service shares, we can see that we broadcast nearly 3,800 TV channels, of which about 10% of those in sub-Saharan Africa, and we distribute live events and films in 3D. Fleet expansion, Atlantic Bird 7 has been launched. It's still, in this slide, is still in the list of channels to be launched, but it was actually launched in 24th of September 2011, so about 2 weeks ago. It's now going through the operations that will conduct it to its final orbital position, and W3C will be launched in 7th of October, in a few days. Just an example, this is just a very schematic example of some of our coverages in Africa. Doesn't mean that we have coverage of this type in several satellites. Now, coming back to probably the most interesting part of my presentation, I wanted to develop a little bit, elaborate a little bit on this concept of KASat, because it's of course something that we are introducing in Europe but can be replicated in other areas of the world. It's and it was already mentioned before. It's the Ka band allows narrow spots with reutilization of frequencies. So we can have in a continent, we have the continent covered by many spots like this, and for our KASat satellite, for instance, it's Western Europe is covered by 80 spot beams, and the satellite delivers a total of 70 gigabytes per second. When I said that we operate the Ka-band system, the KASat system, it's because the satellite is not just a satellite. It's an integrated system with an extensive fiber optic network connecting 8 gateways to make sure that, let's say, the user or the customer is never very far from a connecting point to this fiber network that then links to the satellite. Okay, this is irrelevant. Just, okay, this is all I wanted to say now. Thank you. If I can prepare the floor for Kevin.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Verrett, Regional Director for Africa for Eutelsat. Having a look at the other panelists, Eutelsat is yet a fledgling company. We're just a few years old, and we certainly don't have 40 satellites or 18 like my colleagues do. Eutelsat is a private joint stock company owned by Mubadala, who is the investment arm of the government of Abu Dhabi. We're based in the United Arab Emirates. Our head office and main teleport is in the middle of the desert, about 45 minutes outside of downtown Abu Dhabi. Our vision, and as a new operator, I guess it's important that we have a vision to be the leading satellite operator in the region. And for that reason, we needed to think a bit differently from the other operators who have been around for a while. So we need to be a little bit more user-centric and embrace the partnership approach a little bit more than is currently been done, or as we believe it should be done in the future. We are new, but we do have we have 2 satellites on plan when we started the company. The first satellite, Y1A, went up on 23rd of April. It's co-located with New Dawn on the Ariane 5 launcher. That satellite is up. It is commercial. They are C-band capacity as well as KU broadcasting over MENA. And then there is a KA government payload on there as well. Y1B is the one that was put on the plan to address the broadband market in Middle East, Southwest Asia, and in particular Africa. That satellite is scheduled for launch at the end of December of this year. We've got it down for Q1 of 2012 in case there's a slip on the timeline. This satellite has got 60 spot beams, which has been mentioned many times, the spot beam technology on KA, and I'll go into that a little bit later. So these are the services. The Yarlink is a typical C-band that we offer. Secure is the government service, but the one I want to focus on in particular for Africa is Click, which is being taken to market as high-speed, cost-effective, and it's run on the KA multi-spot beam technology. So just a little bit on, oh dear. That took half of my 5 minutes already. So when we did the design and business case for Y1B, it was important to look at the countries and the region that we find ourselves. So Middle East was important, and we positioned beams there over. But then we needed to look around, and Africa at the time was sitting at 2.2% of broadband users. Subsequent to that, it's grown to 5.6%. So we're hoping that it doesn't grow too much before 2012 when we go up there. I believe that the 5.6 is still small, even though it's grown 100% from previous year. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Maybe I should just mention the bullet point at the bottom is that Eutelsat as satellite operator also finds itself as the broadband provider, and that we put up the gateways, the earth stations, the hub equipment, and the distribution partner has no capital investment in all of that. So Eutelsat for Yaklik being satellite operator and broadband provider. The technology, I'm not going to say any more about KA. Suffice to say that it is frequency reuse, and in this model it's the same it's the same slide or same illustration as Didier did. The frequency measure illustrated in the yellow dots is the one that has been reused 17 times, and therefore we can get the higher throughput and drive the cost per bit down. So it's the same as everyone's been saying, is that KA is the way to deliver broadband, and that's what we believe is the future. So this is the coverage for Y1B. Y1B has got all of MENA covered, and then we've taken the most populous and per capita countries for the first bite of KA band across Africa. We have 2 more satellites planned, which we're hoping will fill up some more of Africa once it's approved. This is just some of the value proposition which we believe makes it a little different to commercial for, I'm getting there, but different for Africa. The price of the terminal has reduced down to $350. Today KU's maybe in the region of $1,500 to $2,000, and monthly starts at $30 US. So the future plans, again, is keep going on KU band, work with the satellite designers and builders to get to these high throughput satellites of 100 gigabit plus satellites, open up more capacity over Africa and maybe some other parts of the globe, and just expand our profile across these countries. I'm getting the finger from the gentleman on my right, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I'm going to pass up my opportunity to ask questions because we're running a bit late, and open it immediately for questions from the floor. I believe we have some roving mics on the floor, so if someone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we'll see if we can get a mic to you as quickly as possible. Questions from the floor to any of the panelists? Maybe I shouldn't have passed up my opportunity. Well, I'm going to ask a few questions then, if I may. At least I don't have to have a roving mic here. I guess the first question I would ask would be to Didier. He talked about mobile trunking and wideband, but have you noticed any trend to these merging? In other words, for example, the mobile of Inmarsat actually is now providing relatively wideband capacity. And what do you think this will have, what effect will this have in the future of satellite designs?
Is it working? Yeah.
Yes.
You're right, Ed. It's true that we all speak about convergence, And this is one kind of convergence that you mentioned. Nevertheless, the last table I had on my last slide was showing that when you speak about broadband, but your name is Inmarsat, you have to address customers all over the world, and you cannot focus your capacity as much as if you are just one operator of one country, and your customers are based only in this country. In this case, you can dedicate your 80 spot beams or whatever the number of spot beams only on this country, which will drive your capacity much, much higher. And then you can name your satellite very high throughput satellites. Whereas in the case of Inmarsat, they have a niche market, which is people traveling all around the world on the ship, on planes. And this obliges them to cover the complete Earth. And it's good for them because in the middle of the sea there is no ground competitor, there is no DSL, no fiber optics, so they have a protected market. But the customer have to pay the price for this isolation from the big terrestrial networks, and they accept to pay it because there is no other solution. On the other side, very focused and very high capacity systems can get much more customer than Inmarsat can do, but they will be in competition with the very fierce and very strong terrestrial networks. So there is a certain level of convergence, but I don't believe it will be total, because you cannot design a satellite to do both.
Thank you very much. Next question to Ladi. You talked about O3b and the system of having a satellite disappearing over the horizon while another satellite appears. That means that you have to have two tracking antennas on the ground at each location. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is this why you've concentrated on trunking? Because if you wanted to get direct to home or direct to consumer, this would probably be infeasible.
Not really. I think we concentrated on trunking because that is actually the best solution for the capabilities of our satellite. Again, there's pockets of the world where there is just that demand to be able to deliver high bandwidth to one central location. And we just feel like the way we've designed our satellite does that better than any other options out there. So. Okay,
thank you. Next question is to Jonathan. You talked about having 419 units of capacity over Africa, and I'm not certain everyone in the audience understands the definition of units of capacity. So perhaps...
That's an easy question. So a unit of capacity is equal to a 36 megahertz transponder.
And you have 419 transponders capable of providing service to Europe, or to Africa.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you very much. Bob, this is more of a technical question to you, because almost everybody has stressed the need for spot beams. There's a limit to how narrow the spot beams can be in order to limit how many you can actually get over any region. What sort of limits do you see given existing satellites, and what might be the limits in the future?
Well, what we're seeing in a lot of the applications that we're using are probably on the order of 0.4 to 0.6 degrees are rather typical. You do start to, as you say, you start to run up against the limits of the technology. We hope to have some improvement, maybe on the order down to 0.3 of a degree. Once you get smaller than that, most of the systems are based on RF tracking systems, and there are errors inherent in that. So between that and the stability of the platform, again, these are very large satellites. You do hit a point where you can't maintain a good pointing accuracy. Now, in some systems, that's allowable. So there's various things that we're looking at to try to improve that, but that really is the practical limitation.
Thank you very much. Also, now a question for Joachim. I'm just passing it down. You know who's going to be next in line. You talked about the Ka-band pioneering aspect of Eutelsat, but do you plan on pioneering Ka-band in Africa as well? Because most of your African coverage was not Ka-band.
Well, we're not the only ones that operate Ka-band satellites. I don't want to seem egoist. We are one of the pioneers, definitely. Well, this is the sort of project that requires a lot of funds, For the moment, we have made an extremely large investment on our network in Europe. We have other satellites on the pipe. Some of the satellites that I've shown on our future program do have Ka-band spots. Africa, of course, because of for natural reasons, because our orbital slots they allow good visibility of Africa. It's probably that one of those spots will drop in somewhere in Africa. If I can add something which is
please do.
An interesting, I think, on what you said about satellites being having specific design requirements for mobiles. If we deviate from the standard mobile communications, voice communications, I wanted to let you know, maybe you don't know, but we run a satellite. We operate a satellite with transponders for delivery of. It's for a sophisticated service, delivery of video content to mobiles, like your normal mobile would. You know that everybody watches content. Well, not everybody, but certain persons watch videos on mobiles, and when in areas where we operate a service using S-band capacity in one of our satellites for delivery of content directly to your normal mobile.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And Kevin, you're a relatively young operator, Eutelsat, with one satellite in orbit, another being launched in December, and others planned. But how much has been the growth in the capacity on your existing satellite, and what are the trends you see for being able to fill up the second and third and fourth?
The Y1A, we were fortunate in that most of it was pre-sold prior to launch, and there may be one or two just transponders hanging around. That the rest is all pre-sold. So we've been very fortunate in that respect. On the KU and KA, the KU we have a JV with SES, which is called YA Live, for broadcasting services on that, and that's taking care of the BSS transponders. And then, of course, the KA government, we have an anchor tenant on that. Mm-hmm. For Y1B, the model is that we have the megabits and we on-sell them via service partners distributorship with a 3 to 5 year projection. That way we know exactly what the projection is and what the point is to execute on the next satellite.
Okay, thank you very much. Having primed the pump, are there any questions from the audience? Because we have to close very quickly, I'm afraid, because of the technical session starting at 3 o'clock. If there are no questions, though, I'd like to ask you to thank the panelists for their presentations. And I'd like to thank you all for attending and listening to them. Thank you very much.